Hello fam, Mariano Gomez, the Dynamics GP Blogster here. Today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Graph and how we can leverage it with Power Automate. The Graph API allows you to do some pretty cool stuff, but there are some little details you got to keep in mind. So today I'm going to walk you through the API, Graph Explorer, how to actually set up an application ID in Azure Active Directory so you can call and apply security to your calls to Graph Explorer or to Graph API. And then we will see a simple example using the Microsoft Teams connector and Graph Explorer to retrieve the tabs of a Microsoft Teams channel. So stay tuned and let's see how it's done. Okay, so for the uninitiated, Microsoft Graph is nothing more than a collection of APIs, and those APIs allow for full integration into all aspects of Azure pretty much and Office. So if you're running Office 365, you have access to a set of APIs via Graph. If you're running things like Teams, you can access and query things from Teams via the Graph Explorer. So speaking of Graph Explorer is just a interface that allows you to basically look at certain requests. For example, if I want to retrieve information about my profile, I can just click on this particular API, and as you can see up here, it tells me that I'm actually querying information about me. That's the endpoint that is exposed via the Graph API. And I can get information back that looks something like this particular payload, this JSON response that you're seeing down here. So this is a sample. So if I actually run this query for myself, you can see, or if I sign in, actually, I gotta sign in first. I can then run additional information about myself. So if I run this particular query, you will see that the response comes back with information about myself. So that's actually very key. As you can tell, then Graph does allow you to do numerous things, and those numerous things are documented in the API reference. So you have, via this API, you have access to things like sites and lists, or for example, today, since we're going to be talking about Microsoft Teams, then you have everything regarding teamwork information. The particular category is broken down into information about a team, a channel, chat messages, app catalog, etc., etc. And particularly we'll be using the tab today. So you can see information about tabs within a team. Not only can you see information, but sometimes some of these APIs allow for post operations, which is nothing more than the ability to create something in the category that we're talking about. In this particular case, teamwork, and for all intents and purposes, Microsoft Teams. I can also update information depending on the type of API that is provided. But not only am I limited to Teams, as I said before, you have the ability to capture information about users. So you can see everything about a particular user profile. You can see that Graph Explorer the Graph API will show me all the definitions and the methods that I can call to, for example, list a user, create a user, get a user, update a user, etc. And I can see the delta, so incremental changes for that particular user. So all in all, the Graph API is very, very powerful. You have the ability to leverage sort of these categories from Graph Explorer. So Graph Explorer does allow you to query the platform as a whole. So if I want to see information about my photo, I can see that's being retrieved from my user profile. I can also see, for example, information on OneDrive, my Outlook calendar. So if I click on Outlook calendar and I see my events for the next week, I can run this query, and you can see that this query automatically returns some entries on my calendar. And obviously, there's nothing like looking at this data on your calendar itself, but this gives developers and certainly citizen developers the ability to feed this information into various types of applications, whether you're creating an application with Power Apps or you're actually writing a workflow with Power Automate, or even if you're actually querying information via Power BI, you can also leverage all these APIs that are here. As I said before, there are a couple things that you need to keep in mind. A lot of these queries do require you to have a certain type of permissions, and these permissions can be actually consented based on your Azure Active Directory profile and credentials. Sometimes there's the opportunity of consenting to the permissions directly here in Graph Explorer before you run the queries. And certainly you have access to an access token that expires after a couple of hours maybe. That token needs to be renewed each time it expires. So I have a history here where there's stuff that I've run as of today, but I've also run some in the past, but you can go back and check the history on Graph Explorer of the different things that you actually executed. So that gives you an idea that you can go back and recover some of this information if you want. And if you are getting familiarized with Graph Explorer, there's nothing more than being able to retrieve the stuff that you think worked for you at some point in time and, leverage it again. So this is not meant to be a detailed explanation of Graph Explorer, but at least give you an idea of where you can locate things, give you an idea of the Graph Explorer and how useful that is to actually provide a query interface to all these particular APIs. I mean, if you're comfortable with Postman, you can actually leverage Postman as well to get the different APIs. All you gotta do is make sure you're aware of the endpoints, you're aware of the headers if there's any, the request body if there's any, the permissions that are needed, you will need to set those, and certainly the access token that is needed to authenticate against the Graph API. So that's it really. As a quick review, that's Graph Explorer in a nutshell. Now, I mentioned that you need to be able to authenticate to the APIs using some form of authentication. So for example, in this particular case, we're using an access token to get to the different API entries. But if you are going to call the Graph API from Power Automate, you must actually register an application. So in order to do that, we have to actually go to the Azure portal. If you do something like aad.portal.azure.com, now you will be in a position to actually set up an application entry for Graph Explorer. So we'll take a look at a few things here. So this is actually my organization's tenant information. And if I go to Azure Active Directory, there is actually an app registration entry here. Now, there's certain type of things that you can do in order to manage this. You can actually set up in enterprise applications, you can actually set up access to Graph Explorer, because that's available in here. And then you could probably assign this to specific groups. But you also have the ability under Azure Active Directory to register a specific application if you don't want to open up the entire Graph API to everybody within the organization. So I can actually set up a new registration here. And the first thing we'll do is we'll identify a name for our app registration. In this case, if I want to do something like Microsoft Teams query, I can set up that registration. And then there's 3 different ways that the application can access this API. You can actually use an organization or an account in the organizational directory. You can use an account in the any organizational directory. This means any Azure AD directory in a multi-tenant scenario, or you can use an account in any organizational directory and personal Microsoft accounts. For example, if you have like a Hotmail account, an Xbox account, whatever you use, that's something that you can do here. For now, all we're gonna do is we're gonna say that the account that that's gonna access what I want is in this particular tenant. So I'm gonna hit register. And the next thing we wanna do here is we get an application. Take note of this. We get an application client ID, we get a directory tenant, we get an object ID. There's no redirection, etc. But here is where you go to set the API permissions. And in this particular case, we have Microsoft Graph here. You can see that the type of permission being added is delegated permission. And what we can do then is we can either add more permissions or grant admin consent. And once we do that, then you can basically interact with this API as if you were an administrator. But if you want to go and add more permissions, then certainly here in Microsoft Graph, we will look at application permissions or delegated permissions. So here in delegated permissions, you have all these host of settings that you can actually work with. In this particular case, what I want to do, or what I'm interested in, is teams information. So I can actually go ahead and grant delegated permissions to team member or teams activities, etc. At the tab level, I can then set up the ability to create a tab, read a tab, and write a tab. And since we're going to be working with tabs, it sounds like this is just about what we need. So we can use this to basically grant the permissions that we need for the Power Automate workflow to be able to access Microsoft Teams. So I'm just going to head here and add these permissions. And as you can see now that these permissions are here, I can probably go ahead and then grant admin consent. And now all these particular entries are basically authorized to query Microsoft Graph. So that's pretty simple. Okay, guys, so now that we have our app registration set up for our Graph API, we now have all the elements that will allow us to access that Graph API in a secure manner. So let's see how we leverage this in Power Automate. So I'm just going to load up the flow designer here, and I'm going to go to my flows, and I'm going to set up quickly a new flow, and that new flow is going to be an instant from blank. So I'm going to actually trigger this manually. And for today's example, we're going to query Teams channel tabs, right? So that's something we're going to do today using this particular flow. And I'm going to go ahead and hit create here. Okay, because this is a manual trigger, I want to ask for the channel name that we want to query on. Okay, so that's the channel name. That's all we need here. It's a string input. So I'm going to actually add a new step. And what this new step is going to do first is I'm going to get a list of actions from Teams. So as you can see here, there's a number of actions that are already available for Microsoft Teams, but one of them is not necessarily listing the tabs of a particular channel. All right, we have the ability to get a team. We have the ability to list a channel, so we can see those two. These two are in preview, but you can still use them. So if I get a team, that should give me information about the team that I'm particularly interested in. And probably one of the things that I'm interested in is the team ID in order to pass that to my Graph API call. And we'll see down the road how you do that. So I'm just going to click on professional services here. That's the one I'm interested in. And my new step, what I'm going to then do is I'm going to actually get a list of channels for that particular team. So once again, if you look at Microsoft Team here, you have list channels, and why not? You could probably use a dynamic content or a specific theme in itself if you want to actually explore the theme that you're going to get. In this case, I'm interested in this, not necessarily interested in a dynamic content right now. And then the next thing I'm going to do here then is I'm going to add a step to filter the list of channels just to get the one that the user requested. So for that, I'm actually do a filter operation. That's a data operation. And this filter array is then going to be applied on the channel list that it was returned from the list of channels. The value is most likely the channel name, and I want that to match exactly the channel name that was inputted by the user previously. Okay, so here we have that. Now, because a filtered array returns also an array as a result, probably what I want to do is I want to add a compose operation just to return the first value within that array. So let's go to compose. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add this compose action. and my input is going to be an expression, and that expression is to return the first element of the array, of the filtered array. So here we go, and we hit OK here. Awesome. Now we have these particular inputs. The next thing that we need to do then is we need to test this out. So I'm gonna just save this and click on test here. All right, let's see what that looks like. I'm gonna perform the trigger action. I'm gonna save and test. And now the next thing we're gonna do here is, the Flow goes ahead and logs into Teams with my credentials. I can hit continue here and say I'm just interested in the general tab or the general channel. We're gonna hit run flow here and hit done. So we'll see how that works. We have here a team, and as you can tell, I have the actual internal ID for that team. I have, what else do we have here? We have the actual team ID. We have an actual internal ID for it. We have and another set of properties that were given to us. Then we list the channels. So these are all the channels in professional services. And this is the general channel, which I was interested in filtering. So we apply a filter against that array, and we effectively get back just that one. And then finally, the array is, we return just the first element for that array. So that's all good. Seems like it's something that we can use. And what we want to do here then is we want to go back to edit, and I'm going to add a new step. In this particular case, what we'll end up doing is using Graph API to actually query that channel or the list of tabs for the general channel that we created, or that we queried before. So I'm just going to use the HTTP request, and note that the HTTP action is a premium connector. So of course you have to have the proper licensing to use that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the get operation or method, and the URI that we're going to use here is this specific URI from the Graph API that allows me to get a list of channels. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go back here in to my expression, and I'm going to use the concat function to basically concatenate all the information that I need. So now there's placeholders for the team ID. Okay, so I'm gonna separate that out with comma and put quotes where needed. There's also a need for a placeholder for the channel ID. So we'll get that from our previous request, and then we complete this. So now, since I need the team ID, what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go back and remove this and go to dynamic expressions. And certainly one of the things that get a team does return is the team ID. So we need this. So we put a team ID here. And then the channel ID is gonna come probably from the compose operation that return the value of the channel, so of the channel ID. So I'm gonna go back here to dynamic content, and I'm gonna scroll up, and here I have outputs, and since all I need is the channel ID, we can then look up that specific value here in the list of outputs. And one way I found to do this is if you go back to flow.microsoft.com, and you basically go to my flows, and you look at your particular flow, you can then go back and look at the result from your previous test and note that that compose would have returned also an ID field. So what we want to do is we want to then include that in this particular parenthesis here. Okay, that's good. So now we have the URI, which was entered as an expression. Now, there is no headers, no queries, no body required for this because this is just a request, but you can confirm that by going to the example and determine how that response will work. Now, if you go back here, the only thing is in advanced options, there is authentication, and that is something you have to deal with. So one method of dealing with this is I have found that you can create, there's two methods actually. You can create variables, and variables for each one of the, for the app ID, the directory ID, and the secret. Or you can actually create a compose operation that encapsulates all that information. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a compose operation. Okay, so that compose action, all it's going to do then is it's going to add as part of the input all that information regarding app ID, directory ID, and secret. And just to distinguish it from the rename, I can call this credentials. Okay, so that's good. Then we can go back to the HTTP action, and then we can change the authentication to Active Directory OAuth. And in this case, the authority is going to be https login.microsoft.com. That's very important. So if you are paying attention to this point, this is going to be the authority that's going to authenticate my credentials against Active Directory. Then the tenant will then probably come from previous operation. So we're going to type this outputs credentials. And then what we're going to enlist from here is the actual app ID field. Okay, so that's one mechanism of doing this. The audience, note that the audience here then refers to who's going to take this request. And then this is going to be coming from graph.microsoft.com. Okay. And then the client ID is simply the app ID. So here in expressions, we're going to go back to outputs, and then we're going to select credentials. That's the name of our previous step. And then we're going to choose from this the app ID. So I'm going to just put app ID here and hit OK. So that's our client. And the credential type is going to be a secret. So we can then enter an expression for this and type outputs. And then we'll select credentials again. And we can go back and evaluate just the secret. All right, cool. So you might ask, well, how do I know all this stuff? Again, if you go back to your run history and you check your payload for that particular compose operation, it should give you all the information you need. So I'm just going to go back here and save this, and I'm going to test this particular request. So here we are. I'm just going to do the general channel under my professional services team, and I'm going to hit done here, and we'll see that run. So hopefully, if everything is in place, we won't get any errors. Effectively, there is one. So it's telling me that the tenant ID was not found. And we can see here that we're passing, perhaps if we see more information, the tenant ID is actually incorrect. I have it inverted with the app ID. So I think all I gotta do is replace this for the correct value. So the secret has been sanitized, so that's very good. So all we gotta do is go back and correct this. For here in tenant, we're gonna use, instead of app ID, directory ID, and that should do. In reality, that was easy to fix. We update this, we can retest using the previous data and save this. So that's gonna run again. And now we should have the results that we're expecting. So now it's coming down the pipeline. And as we can see, they succeeded. And now we have a list of the different entries that are a part of that general tab. So for now, all we have is a wiki value entry, and that's all there is to it. So if I go to teams.microsoft.com and I authenticate into this, you will then see that if I go down to my professional services team, you will see then that here in professional services, there's the general tab, and that general tab then will contain the wiki. And that's about all there is for this demonstration. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you had a chance to appreciate all the capabilities available from Microsoft Graph. Thank you.